It is wild to me that you thought Bob Jones University or college in general would be less restrictive than
Yes.
home because it was college. What did you know about Bob Jones University before you went there?
Yes. So I definitely did some research, and the first thing I did was to read their handbook, or really their rule book. And so I was aware of all the different rules that they had, and I was absolutely dreading it. All the control around the movies, the TV, the music, relationships, what church you could go to, just your behavior and the information you could go to. Like this handbook.
Please explain some of the things in that handbook because I know you go
Yeah.
into depth about this in the
Mhm.
podcast, but some of those rules, I think even if I tried to make up what a fundamentalist Christian school would want students to do, some of these things about movies and things like that, I
Mhm.
would not have been able to predict in advance.
Yeah. So for video games, you couldn't play a game, I think, above a T rating. You couldn't watch any movies above a PG rating. They might have changed it to PG-13, I'm not sure, but I want to say PG. You couldn't watch it above that. When I started going to school there, all the streaming services were blocked, so you couldn't download these apps. They did change that when I was there. They finally unblocked that. But I'm not sure why. That yeah, they unblocked that later on. Let's see here. For music, you could not listen to any kind of secular music at all. You could not listen to even Christian contemporary music because of the beats that they would have. They could be kind of too peppy or pop like for them. So the music that you were allowed to listen to is basically classical music, and then they added in another genre that you're allowed to, which they banned for a while, which is bluegrass, and they changed that for the past president, Steve Pettit, because he loved bluegrass music, so they changed it just for him. So wonderful. And let's see, other rules. They really demonize human touch. Okay, of course, same-sex relationships were not allowed at all. You were not allowed to be there as an openly queer person at all. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. And for heterosexual relationships, guys and girls, they couldn't touch each other. Like they couldn't handhold, they could not hug each other. The only kind of interaction they could have is you can talk in a public space, but that's it. And if it's at
You
night, you have.
you told the story in the podcast about a girl, a woman, sorry, who what was her the issue with her and her boyfriend in public space? Because that to
Yes.
me, that I just
So
read about this and it was
I think I
funny
know
and
what you're
sad.
talking about. Yeah. So there's a story on the podcast where she was having a bad day, and she's standing outside of her dorm in the daylight, and her boyfriend gives her a side hug. And when her boyfriend gives her a side hug, she realizes that the dean of women is sitting in her car watching them. And she freaks out because the dean of women, she is, how do I say this? She is very notorious for being really awful to students, specifically women at Bob Jones University. She abuses her power and she loves it. She loves it so much. And she there are times where she will just like a hawk watch for people to get into trouble. And so she follows this girl into her dorm, and she asks her how's her day going. But what this girl didn't know was this lady had already talked to her boyfriend asking what was going on and blah blah blah. But this girl didn't know this. And so once this woman asks how's your day, this girl's like, "Oh, it's been good." And then the woman just like, "Did you have sex with your boyfriend?" And this girl was like, "Whoa!" Like that was just a quick switch of conversation. Like, why would number one, like it's none of her business anyways, but like this is crazy. You just see someone hug and you assume that they're having sex. And what happened was, then the lady was like, your boyfriend told me that you're actually having a really bad day. So she tripped her up in a lie. And the reason she lied is because at Bob Jones University, you're not allowed to experience things like anxiety or depression or sadness. And this is something that cults do, the emotional control. I mean, I have clips on the podcast where there are people at Bob Jones who say you are not allowed to have anxiety. That's disobeying God. So difficult human emotions are not allowed to experience that because that's seen as sin. You're not having the joy of the Lord. You are saved. You're going to heaven. You have no reason to be unhappy or experience these hard emotions. So you need to believe and trust more. So you put on this mask of always being happy all the time. And so that's why she lied. She lied about how she was feeling because she was afraid of what would happen if she was honest about experiencing mental health issues at this school. And it ended up being I think a week-long interrogation over this side hug from her boyfriend, and they ended up getting demerits for it.
That she got punished for a side hug with her boyfriend.
Mhm.
That's what type
Yeah.
of school we're talking about. This is a question from a commenter. Could men and women shake hands like in greeting?
Maybe they could. It's such a strange thing. Maybe they could. I don't know if Bob Jones have an issue with that. And one thing I want to note is Bob Jones made one exception for a side hug. The one exception they would make for a side hug is if there were these fine art events they would have once a month at Bob Jones that all the students were required to go to. They were usually classical kind of concerts or some kind of play they would put on, but they were called artist series. And most people would bring kind of a date to it. You just sit there, watch this, and then leave. But you were allowed to have a side hug only for a group photo, and then that's it. That was the only exception they would make for that.
That's called a fundamentalist Christian party school.
Yeah.
The reason I first heard of Bob Jones University, and I think it's the association most people outside the circles you grew up in might have, is that this is a school that clung to an interracial dating ban longer than pretty much anyone would have thought possible. Can you tell us about the ban
Mhm.
and why it finally ended?
Yeah, so Bob Jones University banned interracial dating and marriage for their staff and students and faculty until 2000. And yeah, so this was lifted in 2000, and the only reason it was lifted was because of George W. Bush. He was campaigning, and Bob Jones was one of his stops, and this put a national spotlight on the school. And once people realized that, oh my gosh, this school is banning interracial dating and marriage in 2000. Of course, this made Bob Jones University look really bad, so it got a lot of national media attention. And then Bob Jones III, who is notorious for his racism in the past and also homophobia, he went on Larry King Live to talk about it. And it is just, I recommend anyone to watch the end. Just look up Larry King Live, Bob Jones III, and ooh, it is a mess. It is a mess of an interview, and he made the school, I think, look so much worse
Was he
than it
trying
did.
to defend the ban and try to explain in a Christian way why we are trying to do this?
Yeah, I mean, he really did, and it's funny because he announces that he's lifting the ban, and he's like, "Listen," he's like, "This ban doesn't matter to us. It doesn't matter at all. It's just, people made a fuss about it. It's not a big deal on campus. We don't have issues with this, so we lifted it." And it's funny when he said that, and I'm like, "Yeah, because the majority of white people go to your school." Like that's, of course you don't have issues with interracial dating from your perspective. So it was just so ridiculous for me to hear that. And he what I heard him say, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this, but in that world, they are so afraid of the end times and the one world order. And the one world order is when all these different institutions become one. And, there's one religion, there's one government, and interracial marriage and dating was something that they were so afraid. They saw that as being antichrist, a part of the antichrist agenda. And that's what he was talking about. Like I had honestly forgotten about that part of fundamentalism until I saw it again. And my eyes were just I was like, oh my God, I
He's
forgot
trying to
about
explain
this.
end times theology to a secular audience, and in his world, he thinks that makes total sense. And of
Yes, I
course,
was
outside
just
that bubble, it's like, oh my god.
I was horrified, and I was like, I forgot because I was taught growing up by my parents that interracial dating and marriage was a sin. I was taught you weren't supposed to mix the races. That was not what God intended, and that's what they taught. And I've noticed a lot of these racist things and fundamentalism is based on this concept. It's called divine design. And they use this to be transphobic, homophobic, racist, sexist, all these different things to enable the patriarchy and all these different systems. It's a lot of it is rooted in really this idea of like supremacy, but also, and they use it through divine design. It's like, oh, well, God didn't intend it this way. This is against God. And they've used this over and over again. And it hasn't worked out well for them as people continue to call them out for their bigotry for using the same argument. And the thing with like LGBTQ plus families of, oh, this is not how God wanted the family, the institution of the family, we cannot let this happen. Oh, we can't let gay people get married, that's not divine design, that's not what God wanted. So this environment really, it prioritizes really straight white cis men and power. This is what these systems uphold, and it's rooted in supremacy.
I know you said, I mean, the vast majority of the school we are talking about cis, straight, white people. I am wondering, since the interracial ban was struck down by the
Mhm.
school, what, 20 some years ago now?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you are a white guy, so I don't know if it's fair to ask you this. Has the racism problem gotten less? Has it become less of a problem at the school? Do you know what people of color at the school say about it?
Yes, and, like, this is the thing that was really interesting to me about making the Surviving BJU podcast is I wanted to try to get as many people with diverse social identities as possible. So, I do have an episode dedicated to people of color, and it was really hard to find people of color survivors who would come forward. I only could find 2 that were willing to talk about their experiences. But from my conversations with those people, okay, so the one girl in the podcast from India, um, she wore, I think it's called a kurta, this special kind of Indian dress, and it wasn't up to Bob Jones' dress code. It showed a bit, I think, of her belly or her side, her skin of that. And she was pulled aside for wearing this Indian traditional dress. And, she almost got demerits for it, but she said, no, like, y'all are being racist. Like, this is my culture. You can't tell me my culture's like dress is immoral or wrong based on, your standards in your country. And, when she said that, they backed off. They weren't going to mess with that. And this student from India, she said, compared to the other white girl students, that she felt called out a lot more for her dress code than other girls. She said she would walk by and see other people breaking the dress code, but she would get in trouble for, whatever reason. She just felt so out of place and just singled out in that environment. And it was hard for her to see special treatment, especially towards white women around their dress code. And another person I had on the podcast, they talked about their experience in the nursing department and how they were treated by different teachers and faculty of how like they were suspected a lot of cheating, which they didn't do. There was no proof of. So they were like watched by a certain person during test, singled out like that in a classroom. And this story I'm talking about, this happened in the, I think late 2000s, early 2010s. So yeah, still fairly recent. So this person just and they were targeted by a couple of faculty in the nursing department, just trying to get him out of this program to leave the school. And, thankfully the people who did those awful things, they're fired and they're gone now. But just this student would experience this racism, but like the people around them, all the white people around them wouldn't do anything. They weren't experiencing that same thing. So it was really sad to hear those stories. And, I had a friend of mine, which, they decided not to be on the podcast, which I totally understand. But talking with them and, they're a person of color, I talked to them about their experiences and we really bonded with each other because, we were both minority students at the school. She was a person of color. I was queer, but different social identities, but we knew that feeling of not belonging, feeling so out of place. And, she dealt with a lot of judgment from people. People assumed that just she was just very poor and couldn't afford things. I know she had experienced some mistreatment just by people in the financial aid office for different things, and we just felt so alone and just stood out so much in that environment.